going there. All right, I'm very happy to be here tonight, and I want to dedicate this learning session to the memory of Alan Brodwin, my friend, my student, who brought me to Westchester and was really just an incredible lifelong learner. I think it's great that I am here on the coast of California tonight, and we've got a congregation in Cleveland and a congregation in Westchester, and we're really a cross-country group, right? So we're studying American Jewish history across America tonight, which is just terrific. I want to start with a couple of words of introduction about myself and about this series. So as Mark said, my name is Joellyn Zollman, and I have a PhD in Jewish history from Brandeis, which I like to say means that I'm trained to teach everything from creation until yesterday. And they train us that way as Jewish historians because often there's only one of us on a college campus, and that one person is responsible for teaching everything from the Bible to contemporary Israel. But within that really broad stretch of Jewish history, all Jewish historians have a specialization. And my specialization is American Jewish history. All of my writing, my research, my curatorial work focuses on American Jewish history and American Jewish life. So I'm always really happy to have the opportunity to teach where I am most comfortable and most interested and most at home, which is with the history of Jews in America. And that's our subject for this series. Together we'll have 3 sessions, and I'm going to aim to work with you to cover the period from 1654 through the Civil War. Now, will we get to the Civil War? That's always a really good question. I once taught a whole class, a whole American Jewish history class called The End, because we never get to the end when we're trying to study, a stretch of history. And so that was just a class that focused on the 20th century. That was kind of fun. I'm not sure we'll get the whole way to the Civil War, because as you'll see tonight, we've got to rewind a little bit before 1654, the date of settlement on the eastern seaboard of North America for Jewish communities. We've got to rewind a little bit before we get there. But if we don't get to the Civil War, Mark, then that can definitely be my next lecture that we work on. We talked about that earlier tonight. So in other words, what we're going to be focusing on in our time together is what I like to call the lesser known chapters of American Jewish life, the lesser known chapters of American Jewish life. And I am a big fan of these lesser known chapters. I'm a proponent of studying this early period of American Jewish life, and here's why. Too often, the story of American Jewry is told as though it began in 1880 on the Lower East Side of New York. Now, this is perfectly understandable because for so many of us, our own personal history as American Jews is linked to that settlement, right? I would guess that many of you on this Zoom call tonight can trace your own ancestry to the 2.5 million Jews who came between 1880 and 1924, mostly from Eastern Europe and Russia, right? Shaking heads, yeah? Many of you have families who come from that region during that time period, right? It's not surprising because the majority of American Jews can trace their ancestry to that period. And that wave of immigration, those 2.5 million Jews who came from Eastern Europe to the United States between 1880 and 1924, it's a very important wave of Jewish immigration. It is a game-changing wave of Jewish immigration, but it is not the only wave of Jewish immigration to America. In fact, when our grandparents, our great-grandparents, our great-great-grandparents came between 1880 and 1924, they didn't invent American Jewish life from whole cloth. No, there were already some 300,000 Jews living here. And those Jews had created communities and institutions and perhaps most importantly, had established a template for American Jewish life. So these early American Jews played a determinative role in shaping American Jewish identity and community. And as I share highlights of their history with you, you will recognize some of their struggles in current events, some of their ideals in contemporary life, their quest to balance their identity as Jews and Americans, their faith in pluralism, their struggle to balance tradition and change as Jews and Americans, their belief in the promise of America. These are themes in American Jewish history that continue to characterize our community today. This lesser known, but important period of American Jewish history deserves our attention, not just because these early American Jews illustrate certain themes in American Jewish life, but also because these early American Jews launched American Jewish life. So how are we going to explore their stories? How are we going to approach their history? We've got 3 weeks to meet and greet these early American Jews, to explore their lives and their communities. And you might think with such a short time that we are going to take off at 1654 and move at a good pace from there. But alas, that is not how history works. With history, we often must go backward before we move forward. So today we are going to reach pretty far back to understand the beginnings of American Jewry. In fact, I want to talk for a minute about this idea of beginnings. Beginnings are a tricky business for historians. How do you know when a period of history starts? How do you date the beginning of a community? I think to get us warmed up to this idea, I'd like to suggest that you think for a minute about modern Jewish history. Whenever I teach a class on modern Jewish history, the big question is, where do you start, right? Because modernity comes to different places at different times. Modernity comes to the Jews of France before it comes to the Jews of Germany. And it comes to the Jews of Germany before it comes to the Jews in Russia, or someplace like Yemen, where you can argue that modernity never showed up. So, there's no kind of single address for modernity in the Jewish experience. And this is true when you look at a lot of different periods, a lot of different big changes. You really need to look, I think, broadly at the liminal space, the space of change. When do gears start to move? When do changes start to happen? The question of beginnings is challenging. It's a meaningful question for historians. Establishing a beginning is rarely a simple process and almost always involves some consideration of what came before. Every beginning is preceded by an ending, right? So it is with American Jewish history. When one considers the beginning of American Jewish life, I think that there are two dates that are really crucial to remember. And one is a date of ending and another is a date of beginning. Two dates, 1492 and 1654. These two dates, 1492 and 1654, are going to drive our discussion tonight. So I want to start by just defining in the simplest terms why 1492 and 1654 are meaningful dates. And then I'll spend some time relating to you the history that connects these two dates. Let's start with 1492. What happens with 1400 and 1492? You should have like a rhyme playing in your head right now. In 1492, right, Columbus sails the ocean blue. This is an important date in Western history. It marks the date that Columbus sails to the New World. But it's also a very significant date in Jewish history. 1492 is a significant date in Jewish history, and I like to teach this little mnemonic device to my undergraduates when I teach American Jewish history to undergraduates, something that will stick in their heads much like 1492 in Columbus. So what I tell them to memorize is in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. and it sucked to be a Jew if you lived in Spain. I'm not a poet, right? I'm a historian, but that's how I always think of it. 1492 is the date of the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. So it's a very crucial, very critical date in Jewish history. So that's why 1492 is significant. In 1654, just a one-sentence summary of 1654, and not in rhyme this time. 1654 is significant because some 20 Jews arrive in New Amsterdam, the settlement that's later known as New York, with the intention of settling and staying there. This is the beginning of American Jewish life. There are individual Jews who come before 1654 to the eastern seaboard of North America, but they are on temporary sojourns. They are not there to settle and stay. The 1654 community is counted as the first community. It's counted as the beginning of American Jewry because they arrived with the intent to settle and stay. So in order to understand this first American Jewish community, we need to understand 1492. In order to understand 1654, we need to understand 1492, because these first American Jews were Sephardic, and the way that they organized their social and economic and cultural and religious lives bears the indelible imprint of their history in Spain, their expulsion from that country, and their historical experiences as part of the Sephardic diaspora. In order to understand the beginning of American Jewish life, you have to first understand certain aspects of Sephardic history. So tonight we're going to have a little crash course in Sephardic history. We're going to spend some time looking at the Sephardic experience from 1492 to 1654. Specifically, we're going to follow the chain of historical events that led to the 1492 expulsion. And then I'm going to outline the kind of bizarre and confusing issue of Sephardic identity during the 15th and 16th centuries. And finally, I'll describe the characteristics of the Sephardic diaspora communities that launched Jewish settlement on the eastern seaboard of North America. That is our plan tonight. Before we get started, a couple of items of Zoom etiquette. First of all, make sure that you're muted. We've got hosts that will help mute people if they come off of mute, but everyone's experience is better if there's not a lot of background noise. Also, hold your questions until we ask for them. There will be plenty of time for Q&A at the end. Actually, scratch that. Mark had decided at the beginning that if you have questions as we go along, put them in the chat. Put them in the chat or hold them to the end and put them in the chat then, whatever works for you. If you're one of those kind of people who needs to write down the question as soon as it occurs to you, put it in the chat and we'll get to it at the end. Or when we come to the end of the lecture, I'll ask for questions and then we'll have some time for Q&A. There'll also be a couple of times that I ask you to respond in the chat over the course of tonight's lectures. So please do that, participate in the chat that way. Having said that, I don't simultaneously read the chat and deliver the lecture. I've seen people do this. I don't know how they do it. It takes like the totality of my mental, my focus to give the lecture, and I can't simultaneously read the chat. But sometimes I'll ask you to be in the chat, and so please do participate then, okay? All righty, so then let's get started. We're going to start with 1492. We're going to start with the expulsion. The events that led to the expulsion of the Jews from Spain started with and are really deeply linked to the Christian reconquest of Spain, which was completed in the year 1248. Now, prior to 1248, Jews had lived under Muslim rule on the Iberian Peninsula, that's in Spain and Portugal, for 500 years. From 711 to 1248, Jews on the Iberian Peninsula lived under Muslim rule, where they were what I like to call infidels with benefits. Infidels with benefits. Jews were definitely second-class citizens in the Islamic Empire, but as such enjoyed a reasonable amount of security. Jews on the Iberian Peninsula under Islam could freely practice their faith. They could nurture their religious and cultural institutions. They were permitted to engage in a wide variety of professions, and they could settle where they want and move freely throughout Muslim territories, which at that point spread really from the Iberian Peninsula through North Africa, through Cairo and Persia. With these freedoms, Jews could take part in the vibrant economic and intellectual life of the Islamic Empire. And Jews were all in. They created sizable, vibrant Jewish communities in Sevilla, in Granada, in Toledo, in Malaga, in Cordoba, where they worked as merchants and philosophers and poets and artisans. They mastered Arabic and they studied Hebrew. They practiced Judaism and they built synagogues, and they also served in the government. So long as the general economic and social conditions of the Muslim world were characterized by a basic level of prosperity and freedom from external threats, Jews and their Muslim neighbors got along, and both the incidence and fear of persecution were minimal. However, as the Middle Ages progressed, political and economic turmoil in the Muslim world increased. On the Iberian Peninsula, political turmoil erupted with the collapse of the caliphate in Cordoba in the 11th century. Now, you can bet that Muslim Spain's European neighbor and chief rival, the Holy Roman Empire, takes note of the political chaos that's erupting on the Iberian Peninsula in the 11th century, and sensing weakness, begins to advance. And what follows is a really long and brutal fight between Christianity and Islam for control of the Iberian Peninsula. And here we can see a remarkable image. Mark mentioned in his introduction that one of my areas of focus is material culture. That's just a fancy way of really saying art and objects and the built environment. We happen to have this beautiful book, which is still extant from the early 1200s, called the Cantigas de Santa Maria, which is a collection of illustrated medieval songs and poems from the period. This is exactly the period that we're talking about. This is an image that comes from the time of the Christian reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula. And what you can see here are the Christians and the Moors fighting, the Christians and the Muslims fighting for the peninsula. So it's quite extraordinary to have an image from the time period that we're talking about. The Christians are victorious eventually. In 1248, the Christian reconquest of Spain is complete. So when the Holy Roman Empire takes over Spain, the new Christian leadership is very concerned with faith in their new territory. They're the new guys in town. They're very concerned about the faith of their subjects. They are dealing with a population that is thoroughly Arabic in their culture. Even the Christians who lived there were accustomed to thinking of themselves as second-class citizens in the Muslim world. When faced with the problem of how to transform the culture of these people, how to bring them into the Holy Roman Empire, the Pope decided that a PR campaign was in order. The Holy Roman Empire would launch a campaign demonstrating the superiority of Christianity to all of the residents of the Iberian Peninsula, Jews and Muslims and Christians alike. To this end, Dominican and Franciscan friars were dispensed from Rome to travel throughout Spain in the 1300s. And these friars were specifically trained to speak Arabic and to speak Hebrew so that they could take their message to all of the people on the Iberian Peninsula. And their mission was nothing less than to teach the truth of Christianity as a means of shoring up the faith of local Christians and hastening the conversion of Jews and Muslims. In this way, the Holy Roman Empire reasoned that Spain could become a pure Christian nation ruled by Catholic monarchs and populated with Catholic people. There was this sense in the church at the time that the best most peaceful, most progressive way to behave was as one shepherd and one flock. There should be one shepherd, one person in charge, and the flock should all be as similar as possible to that person who's in charge. Diversity is not an ideal in the medieval period. It is not something that people understood they should shoot for. It was this notion that everyone should be homogenous, and that was the best thing for the Iberian Peninsula then, was to come into the fold of the Holy Roman Empire as a majority Christian area. So these Dominican and Franciscan friars traveled throughout Spain and then also Portugal, engaged in spreading the truth of the church. The church is here to welcome you, to support you, to give you a better life. If you want to be happy and healthy and safe and part of the community, if you want to be part of God's world, stick with us, they said. The church is on God's side. So then what's the alternative, right? What will happen if you don't live your life in the church? Well, if you're not on God's side, if you're not with the church, then consequently, you're with the devil. Where does that leave the Jews? So at the same time that these friars are preaching the truth of Christianity as they saw it, they are also educating the public about what they saw as the lies of the Jews. They were engaged in the worst kind of anti-Jewish preaching in churches and in synagogues and in mosques and in town squares. These Dominican and Franciscan friars would stand at the pulpit and on the bema and in the center of town and preach that Jews were the devil, Jews were poisoners responsible for the plague, Jews were sorcerers, Jews used the blood of Christian children to make their matzah, Jews tortured statues of Christ and other holy Christian relics in a mockery of the crucifixion. And Jews basically were the enemy of mankind, intent upon the destruction of Christianity. And you can see in the image that I have up there on the screen, also from the same book that I introduced you to before, some of this education going on. We've got a friar telling the story of the life of Jesus to an enraptured crowd. You can see them all turning their faces up there to him to learn more. And you can see them praying to this statue of Mary and Jesus. And then also, this book is also incredibly interesting because it shows us some images of Jews from the same time. And this is in the same series of images that's kind of across the page from the one we saw in the previous screen. And this is after learning from the Franciscan and Dominican friars the story of the life of Jesus. They come upon some Jews. You see them there in the left-hand image. They're torturing the body of Christ. And maybe you can make that out. It's kind of a yellow figure there. And the Jews, you'll notice, are recognizable by their hunched posture in some cases and their outrageous noses, and the fact that they're torturing Christ. They've got his crown of thorns. You see one of them has lifted it up and they're poking at him. And then in the next picture, the Christians are lobbing off the heads of the Jews with their swords. So again, this book is so interesting. If you want to know more about it, you just Google it after the lecture. You can hear some of the songs being sung by various choirs. You can look some more at the imagery. It's really a wonderful source for this period. But for our purposes, it shows us contemporaneous images of what I'm just describing to you. These friars going around teaching about Christianity and also about their views on the Jews and what that results in the community. This kind of anti-Jewish rhetoric was bad for the Jews. What pushed it over the edge from bad to dangerous was at least two additional factors: economic jealousy and the Black Plague. These factors, combined with rabid anti-Jewish preaching, contributed to widespread and devastating anti-Jewish riots across the Iberian Peninsula in 1391 and 1412. We don't know the exact Jewish population of medieval Spain, But scholars estimate, and Jane Gerber is the person to read on this. Jane Gerber, I can put her name in the chat later, is really the best historian to look at for this medieval period of Spanish Jewish history. She tells us that a third of Spain's Jewish community was murdered during this period, a third converted, and a third managed to remain Jewish during these riots. A third murdered, a third converted, a third stays Jewish. And she thinks there were about 300,000 Jews in Spain. And if you use those numbers, that's 100,000 murdered, 100,000 converted, and 100,000 remaining Jewish. Needless to say, Spain's Jewish community was physically and psychologically devastated as a result of these anti-Jewish riots. Not only had many Jews died, but their synagogues had been destroyed. In some cases, their synagogues were transformed into churches, and maybe some of you who've traveled in Spain have seen these churches. This left Jews without a central location to congregate. And then there was the issue of mass forced conversion. Families were torn apart by it. Neighbors, siblings, sometimes spouses had been converted. It was not possible for these converts to return openly to Judaism. The church would not allow them. Conversion could not be reversed. Moreover, it did not look like the future for Jews in Spain was one of safety or prosperity. With this in mind, some 50,000 additional Jews converted over the next 25 years, some to be with their families, some out of sincere conviction, and some to avoid a grisly death. As a group, these converts were known collectively as conversos. You will sometimes hear them referred to as new Christians. For all of the conversos, the lifting of restrictions that formerly applied to them as Jews meant that their material lot improved overnight. Their pent-up talents were released. They were able to rise to some of the highest positions in areas that were formerly off limits, including the nobility and the military and even the church. Some conversos embraced their new identity with gusto. Others just tried to blend into the crowd. And some continued to secretly practice Judaism. These Jews who secretly continued to practice Judaism are called crypto-Jews. A crypto-Jew or a secret Jew is a convert to Christianity who still secretly practiced Judaism. How many of them were there? We don't know because it was secret, right? It's very hard to count a secret community. So what we do know is from oral histories, we know that crypto-Jews privately avoided forbidden foods, they lit Shabbat candles, they tried to avoid working on Shabbat, and they would often prepare two different dinners on Friday nights, one for the Sabbath that was meat and one that was fish to show to the public. They performed kosher slaughter of animals in their own courtyards, in their inner courtyards, and they held secret Passover seders. They reportedly made great efforts to celebrate Purim, going to the countryside to commemorate the holiday of Queen Esther, who, like them, circulated incognito in the court of the enemy. So this formation of a crypto-Jewish community was the impetus for the Spanish Inquisition. The Holy Inquisition, introduced in Spain in 1481, was an attempt to rout out secret Judaism, charging its adherents, who they derisively, the Inquisition called Marranos, meaning swine, with Judaizing, which is a form of heresy. Heresy and heretical acts are acts of blasphemy against the church. So you might have learned about these Jews when you were younger as Marranos, these crypto-Jews. You might have learned about them by the name Marrano, but that's not a term that we use anymore because it's a derogatory term meaning swine, meaning pigs. Now the preferred term is crypto-Jew. It is a common misconception that the Spanish Inquisition was formed to persecute Jews. This is not true. The Spanish Inquisition was formed in response to the converso situation. The job of the Inquisition was to scrutinize the converso community, the community of converts. Large portions of these new Christians had been forcibly converted and continued to practice their Judaism in secret, even though they maintained a Christian veneer in public. That's heresy, according to the church. These individuals were the targets of the Inquisition, not the Jews. The Inquisition brought with it a reign of terror to the converso community. Inquisitors employed torture to wring out confessions from those alleged to have practiced Judaism in secret, and they burned hundreds at the stake. Eventually, the inquisitors became convinced that it was the Jews who were preventing the assimilation of new Christians to surrounding Christian society. The inquisitors came to believe that the only way to stop the influence of Jews upon conversos was to isolate the conversos from the Jews, at which point they, the inquisitors, convinced King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain to pass a series of zoning laws which required Jews to live in separate areas from new Christians. When secret Judaizing continued, even after these zoning laws had passed, the inquisitors recommended, in an effort to solve the converso problem once and for all, the expulsion of the Jews from the Kingdom of Spain. So in 1492, in an effort to sever the lines of communication between conversos and Jews, Spain's King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, you can see them up there on the screen, expelled all the Jews from their kingdoms, warning them never to return. The Jews were given 3 months to liquidate their property and leave. The decree of expulsion was greeted by the Jews of Spain with despair and disbelief. We really cannot overestimate the mental and physical devastation caused by the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. It is a key facet of Sephardic identity from 1492 forward. Many Spanish Jews sought refuge in neighboring Portugal. 5 years later, in 1497, the royal families of Spain and Portugal were united in marriage. Refugees who thought they had found a safe haven in Portugal, along with the country's native Jews, faced expulsion again. This time, however, they were forcibly baptized en masse and then forbidden to emigrate for many years in order to protect the economic health of that region. Judaism in Portugal consequently fled underground, where it survived clandestinely from one generation to the next. These expulsions, forced conversions, and the creation of secret Jewish communities led to a very confusing state of identity for Sephardic Jews in the 15th and 16th centuries. The most straightforward identity and experience belonged to openly practicing Jews. Expelled from Spain, these Jews moved on to establish Sephardic communities in the Ottoman Empire, in southern Italy, and in France. More complicated in terms of identity and geography was the converso population. The converso community was under constant scrutiny from the Inquisition because of their Jewish ancestry. Now, some of these conversos are crypto-Jews, some of them are not crypto-Jews, but all of them are suspect. So it's understandable that conversos on the Iberian Peninsula during this period also wanted to flee, but their options were limited. Where could they go? The Spanish Empire didn't want them to leave. So if you were a converso, where would you want to go in the empire? And I put in a map of the empire up there. The Spanish Empire was vast. After 1492, it grows and grows for quite some time. All of these conversos are under suspicion, whether they're crypto-Jews or not. If that was the case, where would you want to go? Let me know in the chat. Where would you go if you were a converso and under suspicion from the Inquisition? Where would you head? Yep, one idea is Amsterdam. That is a very good idea. Check out the map. Greece. Yeah, maybe. I mean, you've got to stay. Basically, no one will let you leave the Spanish Empire. You've got to stay within it. But you want to be going, yeah, you guys are getting the idea. You want to be going to the most far-flung corners of that Spanish Empire, right? You want to get far away from the long arm of the Inquisition as possible. And think about this. Once you're in these far-flung areas, which by the way include the New World, right? You can see all those red areas in the New World there. You might want to get that far away from the Inquisition. They include the Netherlands. And once you're there, once you're in these parts of the New World, let's get back there. Where do you think you might want to live? The place where you want to live is either on the border or in a port. On the border or in a port. Now, the Inquisition would allow Jews to move throughout the Spanish Empire because Jews were good for trade. They were good for business, but they kept an eye on them. However, if you were living in somewhere that was near a border, and you were Jewish, you would try to settle very close to that border so that you might be able to hop across and get away from the Inquisition that way. Or you live in a port, both because it facilitates business, but also because it facilitates your ability to leave, right? So in this way, we see a couple of interesting things happening in the Sephardic community. We see the establishment of a Sephardic diaspora. We've got a good map of that there. A Sephardic diaspora that's going to spread from Amsterdam to Venice, through Lyon and Lisbon and Seville to Constantinople and Salonika and the New World, all these places you guys mentioned. In all of these places, we see Sephardim settling in ports. We see them settling on borders. In this way, they are ideally situated to participate in trade, to move goods around the continent and across the world, because there's a Sephardic cousin now in all of these ports, right? The real irony of the expulsion of the Jews from Spain is that it actually propels the Sephardim to the forefront of the emerging global economy, because it sets them up in these port cities all over the world, and they're ideally situated for the advent of capitalism, for the advent of global trade. So this was certainly true in one of these Sephardic diaspora communities that's very important for our story today, which is the community of Amsterdam. So Amsterdam was part of the Spanish Netherlands until 1600. It was one of those far-flung corners of the Spanish Empire. And Amsterdam had attracted a lot of conversos, a lot of Jewish converts to Christianity. So when the area won its independence from Spain, those conversos who were living there found themselves in a very advantageous situation. The Republic of the Netherlands, newly independent from Spain and bitterly antagonistic toward the Inquisition, emerged in the year 1600 as a vibrant center of world trade and a mecca of religious tolerance. The Republic of the Netherlands had a government based on Calvinist principles, which tolerated religious diversity among its residents. This reputation for tolerance, as well as their thriving trade economy and a well-equipped fleet, meant that if you were a converso who wasn't living there already, you very much wanted to make it your home. First of all, if you were living in Amsterdam after they freed themselves from the Spanish Empire, so from 1600, you're free from the Inquisition, Dayenu, right? You have loads of economic opportunity, especially in trade, as the Dutch Republic is an emerging mercantile power, Dayenu. And you could definitely publicly return to Judaism if you so desired, Dayenu, Dayenu, Dayenu. For all of these reasons, Amsterdam was a magnet for conversos generally and for crypto Jews specifically. Now, the story of the reemergence of public Judaism in Amsterdam is fascinating stuff. Because think about it, there are all these Jews from Spain and Portugal who for now generations have been living secretly as Jews and then are going to reemerge publicly as Jews, but they haven't lived publicly as Jews for a long time. So how do they become Jewish? What does that mean for them? How do they change Judaism? What parts of it do they embrace? That's not our story today, but it is a very, very interesting story. Our focus today is on the Netherlands as a colonial power and on Amsterdam specifically as the launching pad for the formation of a Jewish community in the New World. So during the Dutch Golden Age, and we're talking about the late 17th, the late 16th and through the 17th centuries, the Dutch Republic dominated world trade. It's funny for us to think of because it's like a tiny little republic, right? But they managed to conquer a vast colonial empire and operated the largest fleet of merchantmen of any kind of region or nation at the time. To this end, in 1630, the Dutch Republic captured the colony of Pernambuco in Brazil from the Portuguese, and Amsterdam actively recruited Jews to settle their newly acquired Brazilian colony. Now, why? Why would the Dutch capture this colony in Brazil and then ask the Jews living in Amsterdam to go and settle there? They captured it from the Portuguese. The colony is Pernambuco. Why would they want Jews there? If you have any ideas, go ahead and put them in the chat. Why do you want Jews in your colony in Brazil that was formerly a Portuguese colony? Yes, you guys are getting it. Trade. First of all, if you want a booming economy, if you want trade, you tap into those Sephardic merchants who have, really contacts all over the world. So yes, but there's something else going on there. Remember, they're loyal subjects, absolutely. Jonathan suggests they're loyal subjects. So loyal, rather, subjects, because they're grateful to the Dutch for giving them their religious freedom. But here's something else. They speak Portuguese. So the colony was formerly a Portuguese colony. Many of these Jews, the Sephardim who live in Amsterdam, they speak Portuguese. They worship still in Ladino and in Portuguese. So they've got the language to help with the economic foundations that have already been built in that particular colony. So recognizing this region's great economic potential in South America, a large group of Amsterdam's Jews move to Pernambuco. They settle in the colony's main city, which is known as Recife. At its height, Recife was home to somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 Jews, between 1/3 and 1/2 of Dutch Brazil's total white civilian population. Between 1/3 and 1/2 of Dutch Brazil's total white civilian population was Jewish. The Jewish community in Recife supported 2 synagogues, because of course there were 2 synagogues. There's the one that you go to and the one that you absolutely do not go to, right? So there are 2 synagogues in Recife. They have schools, 2 Jewish schools. They have ordained rabbis in Recife. This is more Jewish communal leadership and organization than any North American Jewish community is going to be able to claim for another 200 years. Most importantly, the Jews of Dutch Brazil enjoyed rights unmatched by any other 17th century Jewish community in the world. The Jews of Recife were guaranteed equal treatment by the government. This is an astounding concept in the time period. The Calvinist government in the Netherlands tolerated religious diversity at home, but was willing to go a step further and offer equal treatment before the law in Recife, likely as an incentive for Jewish settlement and trade there. But the reign of Recife as the freest Jewish city in the world was brief. Portugal invaded and conquered Dutch Brazil on January 26, 1654. With the Portuguese comes the Inquisition, which scared the Sephardim out of Recife. The Jewish community of Recife scatters. Some Jews return to Amsterdam. Others who had acquired a taste for the climate settled in Dutch colonies nearby, including Suriname and Curacao. And finally, and most importantly for us, a boatload of 23 souls, big and small, 23 Jewish refugees from Recife traveled to the remote Dutch colony of New Amsterdam, or what we today call New York. These were the first New York Jews. So what have we learned about these 23 settlers who are going to move our story onto American soil next week? We know that they are Sephardic Jews, that their ancestors left Spain or desired to leave Spain at the same time as Columbus in 1492, but it took 162 years longer to get here to North America. These 162 years were marked by historical experiences, both tragic and celebratory. While the collective memory and collective consciousness of these settlers was shaped by the horrors and the injustice of the Inquisition and expulsion, they also had experienced firsthand religious tolerance in Amsterdam and in Recife. These Sephardic settlers in 1654 were adventurers on the high seas. They were explorers of new worlds. They are risk takers who know how to create Jewish community where none had existed before, and how to build and maintain relationships with non-Jews in order to create economic success and civic stability. These are the Jews who settle America. And that is going to make all the difference, as we shall see when we come together next week. Okay, that's what I have for you guys today. In addition, I always end every lecture with some suggested sources for further study. This week I've got 3 books to recommend to you. American Judaism, Jonathan Sarna's opus on American Jewish history. Dr. Sarna was my advisor and is really the dean of American Jewish history. A wonderful novel right in the middle, if you haven't read it, The Weight of Ink, which talks a good deal about the Sephardic experience in both London and Amsterdam. And then finally, a book called God's Jury, which focuses very much on the Inquisition and the way that it helped to make the modern world. So for those of you who leave tonight craving some more content, those are my top 3 suggestions. At this point,